My son announced my retirement at his daughter's wedding. I learned about it at the same moment as the other 180 guests. The champagne had just been poured. The bride and groom were seated beneath a canopy of white roses, and my son Richard was standing in front of the band with a microphone in one hand and a glass in the other. He began with the kind of speech fathers are expected to give. He welcomed Jonah into the family. He praised his daughter Sophie's courage, intelligence, and stubborn refusal to accept anything less than what she believed was right. People laughed at that last part. Richard did not. Then he looked directly at me. "And tonight," he said, "we are celebrating another important transition. My father, Henry Caldwell, has decided to retire after 47 years of leading Caldwell Restoration Group." The room erupted in applause. My sister-in-law reached across the table and squeezed my hand. An old employee lifted his glass toward me. Someone near the dance floor shouted that I deserved it. I did not move. Because I had made no such decision. Richard continued before I could stand. He has also approved the sale of the company to Vanguard Heritage Partners, ensuring that the business he and my mother built will continue long after all of us are gone. A large screen behind him illuminated. There was my photograph. Beside it were the dates 1979 to 2026, as though I had already died. Beneath the photograph appeared the words, "A legacy secured. A future protected." I pushed my chair back. Richard's wife, Elaine, leaned toward me. "Henry, please don't make a scene." "A scene? You agreed to this?" "No, I did not." Her eyes moved toward Richard. For half a second, fear crossed her face. Then it vanished. Richard raised his glass. "To my father. To the company. And to knowing when it is time to place the future in safer hands." That final sentence was not meant for the guests. It was meant for me. Before he could drink, Sophie stood. She was still wearing her wedding dress. The lace around her sleeves trembled because her hands were shaking. "Dad, stop." Richard lowered the microphone. "Sophie, sit down." "No. This is not the time. You chose the time." She walked across the dance floor and took the microphone from him. Richard did not resist, perhaps because 180 people were watching. Sophie faced me. "Grandpa, I'm sorry." "For what?" She reached beneath the head table and lifted a cream-colored folder tied with the same blue ribbon used on the wedding invitations. She opened it. Inside was a document carrying my name. Sophie read the first paragraph aloud. "I, Sophie Caldwell, state that my grandfather, Henry Caldwell, has displayed progressive confusion, impaired judgment, financial recklessness, and an inability to understand the consequences of major business decisions." The reception hall became completely silent. She continued, "I believe it is necessary for Richard Caldwell to assume complete control of Caldwell Restoration Group and the Caldwell Family Trust for the protection of my grandfather and all beneficiaries." Richard stepped toward her. "Give me that." Sophie moved away. "You made me sign it. I asked you to tell the truth. You told me the wedding would be cancelled if I didn't." The guests began whispering. Jonah rose from his chair and stood beside his wife. Richard looked at him. "Stay out of this." Jonah answered quietly. "She is my wife." Sophie looked at me again. "I signed it 3 months ago. I was afraid. Dad had already paid deposits for the venue, the caterer, and the apartment Jonah and I were supposed to move into. He said the company was in danger because you were refusing to accept that your memory was failing." "My memory is not failing. I know that now." Richard took the microphone from her. "This is a family disagreement being distorted by emotion. My father has undergone medical evaluation. He has forgotten meetings, approved contradictory expenses, and nearly caused the company to lose its largest contract." I walked toward him. "You announced a sale I never approved." Richard's expression remained calm. You approved it in writing." He gestured toward the screen. My photograph disappeared. A signed agreement appeared in its place. The signature at the bottom looked exactly like mine. Richard lowered his voice. "You signed on February 12th. In your office. In front of 2 witnesses." February 12th was the day after the 3rd anniversary of my wife's death. I had spent most of that week alone. I remembered Richard bringing papers to the house. I remembered signing something. But I did not remember agreeing to sell my company. Sophie removed another document from the folder. "This isn't the sale agreement Dad showed you. It's the complete version." Richard's calm expression finally cracked. "Sophie, tell him what Schedule 7 says." She read it herself. Upon completion of the acquisition, the Caldwell Workshop, the company archive, the Employee Training Center, and the residential property located at 17 Briar Lane may be sold, redeveloped, or transferred at the purchaser's sole discretion. 17 Briar Lane was my home. The house where Margaret and I had raised our children. The house Richard had promised would remain outside the deal. Sophie turned the page. "And Dad receives a $1.8 million transition bonus if the sale closes before the end of the month." A woman near the back of the room gasped. Richard's oldest employee placed his glass on the table. My son stared at his daughter. "You have no idea what you've done." Sophie's voice broke. "I know exactly what I did. I stopped helping you bury Grandpa while he was still standing in front of us." That was how my granddaughter's wedding ended. Not with dancing. Not with a bouquet thrown into a crowd. But with my family divided across the ballroom while a contract containing my signature glowed behind us like evidence at a trial. My name is Henry Caldwell. I was 72 years old when my son attempted to take my company, my home, and the right to decide whether I was still capable of making decisions for myself. At first, I believed the story was simple. Richard had become greedy. He had lied to me, frightened his daughter, and arranged a secret sale for personal profit. But families rarely fracture for one simple reason. And before that week ended, I would discover something much harder to accept than my son's betrayal. Richard had not invented every accusation against me. Caldwell Restoration Group began with a borrowed truck and a toolbox that belonged to Margaret's father. Margaret and I were 25 when we purchased a condemned boarding house in Bellwether, Virginia. The roof leaked. The wiring was dangerous, and pigeons had occupied the 3rd floor with greater confidence than we had. Everyone told us to demolish it. Margaret stood in the entrance hall, looked at the damaged staircase, and said, "The wood is still good." That became the principle on which we built our lives. Do not discard something merely because damage is easier to see than value. We restored the boarding house and sold it to a family who converted it into a small hotel. Then came a library, 2 churches, an abandoned mill, and an old courthouse everyone believed was beyond repair. Margaret understood design, color, and people. I understood timber, stone, and the behavior of buildings that had survived owners who believed maintenance was optional. She could convince a banker that a cracked theater deserved another century. I could convince a crew that the impossible schedule she promised was almost reasonable. By our 20th anniversary, we employed 43 people. By our 30th, we employed 112. When Margaret died, the company had 146 employees and active projects in 5 states. We had 3 children. Richard was the oldest. Claire came 3 years later. Michael was the youngest. Richard was born cautious. At 8 years old, he checked whether doors were locked before going to bed. At 12, he created an inventory of my tools because he believed I wasted money replacing things I had misplaced. At 16, he worked payroll during a summer when our bookkeeper became ill. He did not need to be asked twice. That was the quality I praised most in him. It was also the quality I eventually exploited. Claire was different. She argued with teachers, questioned every company rule, and once organized a crew protest because I had refused to replace the vending machine in the workshop. She became an attorney. Margaret said it was the only career that paid Claire to continue doing what she had done for free since childhood. Michael loved buildings as much as I did. He could enter a ruined house and immediately see the completed room. He had Margaret's imagination and my impatience. He also had a way of making every person in a room feel that something interesting was about to happen. I never said Michael was my favorite. I did not have to. Richard knew. Claire knew. Margaret knew too. Whenever Richard solved a problem, I thanked him. Whenever Michael proposed an idea, I became excited. A dependable child receives responsibility. A charming child receives attention. Parents often tell themselves those are equal gifts. They are not. Michael died at 29. He was driving home from a project during heavy rain when another vehicle crossed the center line. The police officer who came to our house removed his hat before I opened the door. I knew before he spoke. There are moments that divide life so completely that every memory is labeled before or after. Michael's death was ours. Margaret grieved by working. Claire grieved by becoming angry. Richard grieved by taking over every responsibility no one else could carry. I grieved by becoming less available to the living. For almost 2 years, I visited projects but made few decisions. Richard negotiated contracts, managed crews, met with banks, and sat beside Margaret during the nights when she could not sleep. He was 34 years old with a wife, a young daughter, and a father who appeared only when something had gone wrong. He never complained. At least, not where I could hear him. 1 year after Michael's death, Richard and I argued at the workshop. He had cancelled an ambitious theater restoration Michael had designed before he died. Richard said the budget was unrealistic and the client had no reliable financing. I accused him of using caution as an excuse to erase his brother's work. Then I said something I spent the next 14 years pretending I had not said. If Michael were alive, none of this would be falling apart. Richard became very still. He did not shout. He did not defend himself. He only placed the project file on my desk and said, "Then I hope someday you find someone worth listening to." The next morning, he returned to work. So did I. Neither of us mentioned the sentence again. Silence did not erase it. Silence preserved it. Richard eventually became Chief Operating Officer. Claire handled legal contracts for several years, but she and Richard clashed constantly. He believed she created obstacles without understanding operations. She believed he used urgency to avoid accountability. 6 years before the wedding, Claire left the company. Richard said she had accepted a position in Washington. Claire told me the same thing. I did not ask why neither of them could look at the other during her farewell dinner. Margaret asked more questions than I did. She believed the company had become too dependent on Richard. She wanted a formal board containing independent members and employee representatives. Richard called the proposal unnecessary bureaucracy. I sided with him. "He has earned our trust," I told her. Margaret answered. "Trust is not a replacement for structure." I wish I had remembered that sentence before the wedding. Margaret became ill 4 years later. Ovarian cancer had already spread by the time doctors found it. She lived 17 months after the diagnosis. Richard managed the company. Claire visited whenever work permitted. I took care of Margaret and convinced myself nothing else mattered. During her final months, Margaret asked me to promise 2 things. First, that the company would never become more important than the people working inside it. Second, that no child would control the family trust alone. I promised. Then she died, and promises made beside a hospital bed became papers I could not bear to examine. For nearly a year, I signed whatever Richard placed in front of me. Insurance renewals. Project guarantees. Banking resolutions. A temporary power of attorney allowing him to manage company accounts while I recovered from grief in a minor heart procedure. Richard did not need to forge every signature. I gave him several willingly because reading the documents required attention I did not want to give. That fact would later become the strongest weapon he used against me. After the wedding reception collapsed, I left with Claire, Sophie, and Jonah. Richard remained behind with Elaine, the guests, and the representatives from Vanguard Heritage Partners whom he had seated near the front. That detail bothered me. My son had invited the buyers to his daughter's wedding. The announcement had not been spontaneous. It had been a closing ceremony disguised as a family celebration. We returned to my house on Briar Lane. Sophie removed her shoes and sat at the kitchen table in her wedding dress. Jonah made coffee no one drank. Claire spread the documents across the table. I asked Sophie the question I had avoided in the ballroom. Why did you sign that statement? She looked down. Because I believed him. Did you believe I was incompetent? I believed you were becoming vulnerable. That is not the same thing. I know. Her eyes filled with tears. Dad showed me emails where you approved 2 different prices for the same project. He showed me a video of you forgetting the name of a client you had known for 20 years. He said you had left a stove burning. I did leave the stove burning. Grandpa. I was heating soup and fell asleep in the chair. That was careless. It was not proof that I had lost my mind. Sophie wiped her face. He said the statement was temporary. He said it would allow him to refinance debt and protect the company. Then he said the wedding deposits had been paid from a business account and the company could no longer cover them unless I helped. How much did the wedding cost? She hesitated. $84,000. Jonah looked uncomfortable. We did not ask for that kind of wedding. Richard insisted, Sophie said. He said clients and investors would attend. He turned it into a company event. Claire continued reading the acquisition agreement. This sale is worth $14.2 million. Is that reasonable? Sophie asked. 5 years ago, the company was valued above $30 million. Claire turned several pages. Vanguard assumes the company debt, but it can close the Bellwether workshop, sell the archive, and terminate future contributions to the employee profit-sharing plan. How much debt? I asked. She found the number. Then she read it twice. $11.6 million. I stared at her. That is impossible. The last report I reviewed showed less than $4 million. When was that? Last year. Which month? I could not remember. No one said anything. They did not need to. For the first time that night, I wondered whether Richard had been telling the truth about at least one thing. Maybe I no longer understood the company bearing my name. Claire called an attorney named Nadine Brooks. Nadine specialized in closely held businesses, family trusts, and the expensive disasters created when people believed those two things should operate on affection. She arrived at 8 the next morning. She was small, direct, and carried one leather case containing fewer papers than Richard had used to announce my retirement. Nadine reviewed the documents. Then she asked whether I had signed the sale agreement. I signed something on February 12. What did you believe it was? A refinancing authorization. Did you read it? No. She did not soften her expression. Mr. Caldwell, that answer may prevent us from proving fraud. If the signature is authentic and you had an opportunity to read the document, carelessness is not automatically incapacity or deception. He told me it was refinancing. Can anyone confirm that? My housekeeper may have heard. May have heard is not evidence. Sophie placed her statement beside the agreement. He forced me to sign this. Nadine looked at her. Did he physically threaten you? No. Did you understand the document? Yes. Did you sign voluntarily? Sophie's face fell. I signed because he threatened to cancel my wedding. That may establish coercion, but it will depend on the communications. Do you have messages? Sophie opened her telephone. Most of Richard's demands had been made in person. His messages were careful. They referred to protecting me, helping the family, and making difficult choices. Richard had spent a lifetime managing contracts. He knew dangerous sentences were safer when spoken. Then Jonah spoke. I recorded one conversation. Everyone turned toward him. He removed his telephone. The night Richard brought the statement to our apartment, Sophie became frightened. I started recording after he raised his voice. He played the file. Richard's voice said, "You are not diagnosing him. You are confirming what the doctors already know." Sophie answered, "Grandpa's doctor has never said he is incompetent." Richard said, "His doctor does not see him making $10 million mistakes." Then Sophie asked, "What happens if I refuse?" Richard paused before answering. "The venue balance is due Friday. The apartment guarantee can also be withdrawn. You are old enough to decide whether one signature is worth destroying your own future." The recording ended. Nadine leaned back. "That helps. Can you stop the sale?" I asked. "I can request an emergency injunction. But first, I need to know who owns the voting shares." I owned 40%. Richard owned 25%. Claire owned 15%. Margaret's family trust owned the remaining 20%. A sale required approval from holders of 75%. Without my 40%, Richard could not complete it. Unless I was declared incapacitated. Under the trust papers Richard had shown us, he would become voting trustee if I became unable to serve. With his own shares, the trust shares, and the agreement carrying my signature, he could claim the required approval. Sophie's statement was not merely a family accusation. It was the final piece of the transaction. Nadine filed the injunction that afternoon. Richard responded within an hour. He sent letters to every company employee stating that I was attempting to block the only transaction capable of preventing bankruptcy. By evening, my telephone filled with messages. Some employees begged me to reconsider. Others accused Richard of selling them. Several simply asked whether they would receive their next paycheck. I could not answer. At 6 the following morning, someone painted the word "selfish" across the gate of my house. At 8, a reporter arrived. At 10, the bank froze the company's unused credit line until ownership authority could be resolved. By noon, Richard had transformed our private betrayal into a public emergency. Then he came to see me. I watched his car enter the driveway through the front window. He carried no folder. No lawyer followed him. For a moment, he looked like the son who had returned to work the morning after I compared him to his dead brother. I opened the door but did not invite him inside. "Did you send people to paint my gate?" "No." "Did you tell them I was destroying their jobs?" "I told them the truth." "You lied about my retirement." "I announced a decision you had already signed." "You told me those papers refinanced debt." "They did. The sale refinances everything by paying it off." "That is not what the word means, and you know it." Richard looked past me into the house. "Can we speak without Claire and her attorney turning every sentence into evidence?" "No." He nodded slowly. Then listened from the doorway. Richard removed a folded sheet from his pocket. It showed company cash flow for the next 6 weeks. The final column was red. "We cannot make payroll next month. We owe suppliers $3.1 million. 2 clients are withholding payments because projects are late. The courthouse contract lost $4 million after a subcontractor falsified structural reports." "Why didn't you tell me?" "I did." "When?" 7 meetings in 18 months. You attended 3. You left one because an old photograph of Mom was hanging in the conference room. The cruelty of the sentence came from its accuracy. Richard continued. "I mortgaged my house. I sold the cabin Elaine inherited from her parents. I put $900,000 of our own money into the company. I delayed my salary for 11 months. And the $1.8 million bonus? Reimbursement and retention. Call it whatever makes you comfortable. You would receive almost $6 million from the sale. Claire receives more than 2. I received less than either of you after the money I invested. You pressured your daughter to call me incompetent. Because you are not functioning as an owner. That is different from being mentally incapable. Not to the people whose jobs depend on your signature. I stepped onto the porch. You could have petitioned the board. We do not have an independent board because you rejected Mom's proposal. The sentence stopped me. Richard watched my face. He knew he had reached the part of the argument I could not deny. You wanted trust, he said. You gave me responsibility without oversight, authority without support, and every crisis no one else wanted. Then, when I made decisions, you called me controlling. You hid $11 million in debt. I hid failure from a father who only noticed me when I failed. I looked at him. He was 48 years old. For the first time, I could see the exhausted 34-year-old who had held our company together while I mourned Michael. Then Richard said, I did not steal your company. I carried it while you waited for the son you loved more to come back from the dead. He walked away before I answered. I remained on the porch until his car disappeared. Anger would have been easier if everything he said had been false. But the truth had divided itself between us. Richard had manipulated documents, coerced Sophie, and attempted to seize legal control. I had abandoned my responsibilities while continuing to enjoy the authority attached to them. He had treated my grief as incapacity. I had treated his reliability as an unlimited resource. That afternoon, Nadine arranged for an independent financial review. The accountant was named Patricia Givens. She spent 2 days inside the company server and emerged with 3 conclusions. First, the company was in genuine danger. Without new financing or an asset sale, it would default within 6 to 8 weeks. Second, Richard had invested nearly everything he claimed. There was no evidence that he had stolen company money. Third, he had concealed the full debt from shareholders and pledged assets he did not have authority to pledge. One of those assets was my home. Another was Sophie's educational trust. When Sophie was born, Margaret placed shares and cash into a protected account for her education and future home. The account had once held $640,000. Its remaining balance was $83,000. Richard had used the rest as collateral for company loans. Sophie read the report at my kitchen table. Her expression did not change until she reached the authorization page. Then she placed the paper down. My signature is here. Did you sign it? Claire asked. No. The signature looked convincing. It had been copied from the wedding venue agreement. Richard had used the wedding he offered to finance as the source of the signature he needed to place her inheritance at risk. Sophie left the room and became sick in the downstairs bathroom. Jonah followed her. Claire closed the report. That is forgery. I know. We need to report it. He is your brother. And Sophie is his daughter. Claire's voice became quiet. Dad, this is what you always do. You wait until harm becomes undeniable, and then you search for a way to describe accountability as disloyalty. That is not fair. It is exactly why I left. I looked at her. You said you accepted another position. I did. After Richard forced me out. There was another truth my children had allowed me not to ask about. 6 years earlier, Claire had discovered that Richard was shifting project losses between subsidiaries to avoid violating bank requirements. The practice did not place money in his pocket, but it made company finances appear healthier than they were. Claire refused to approve the annual report. Richard accused her of threatening the company over technical accounting classifications. Margaret wanted an independent review. I did not. I told Claire that family members should resolve disagreements privately. Richard told her that if she refused to sign, he would inform clients that she had delayed projects through legal interference. Claire resigned. Why didn't you tell me? I tried. You said Richard understood the numbers and I did not. I remembered the conversation. Not the details. Only my impatience. Claire looked toward the hallway where Sophie had disappeared. You did not create what Richard became. But every time he crossed a line to protect the company, you rewarded the result and refused to examine the method. Now he believes saving something gives him ownership of everyone damaged in the process. The emergency hearing took place 4 days after the wedding. Richard arrived with 2 attorneys, the company's chief financial officer, and a physician who had evaluated me 8 months earlier. The physician did not say I had dementia. He said I had displayed mild cognitive changes associated with grief, stress, medication, and age. He recommended follow-up testing. I had cancelled the follow-up appointment. I told myself I was busy. The truth was that I did not want anyone measuring what I might have lost. Richard's attorneys presented missed meetings, unsigned reports, contradictory project instructions, and the agreement carrying my authentic signature. They argued that he had acted under emergency authority to preserve the company. Nadine presented Jonah's recording, Sophie's statement, the forged trust authorization, and evidence that Richard had concealed material terms of the sale. The judge refused to declare me incompetent. But she also refused to restore my unrestricted control. She appointed a temporary independent custodian over the company and allowed negotiations with Vanguard to continue. The final sale could proceed if the voting requirements were satisfied and if the custodian determined bankruptcy was otherwise likely. Richard remained chief operating officer. I remained a shareholder. Neither of us was permitted to act alone. Outside the courthouse, reporters surrounded us. One asked whether I would sacrifice 146 jobs to maintain control. Another asked Richard whether he had forged his daughter's signature. He answered neither question. Then a company supervisor stepped toward me. His name was Luis Ramirez. He had worked beside me for 31 years. My daughter just started college, he said. My wife's insurance comes through the company. I need to know whether I should start looking for another job. I'm trying to save the company. That is what Richard says too. Luis walked away. The disappointment in his face followed me home. That night, I considered withdrawing the case. The sale was imperfect, but perhaps it would preserve enough jobs. Maybe Richard's methods were the price of avoiding collapse. I placed the acquisition agreement on the desk Margaret and I had shared. Her reading glasses still remained in the top drawer. I had not moved them. I opened the drawer. Beneath the glasses was a small brass key. I recognized it. It opened Margaret's document box in the company archive. Richard had told me the box contained personal letters and outdated insurance papers. After her death, I had never opened it. At 7 the next morning, Claire and I entered the archive under supervision of the court-appointed custodian. The box was stored in a locked cabinet behind decades of project photographs. The key turned. Inside were letters to each child, an unfinished memoir, and a sealed envelope addressed to the trustees of the Caldwell Family Trust. The envelope had already been opened. The original document inside was missing. But Margaret had placed a handwritten note beneath it. If this envelope is open and the amendment is absent, ask Elena Moreno for her retained copy. Elena Moreno had been Margaret's personal attorney. She had retired shortly before Margaret became ill. Richard had told us Elena no longer represented the family. Claire called her. Elena answered on the 4th ring. When Claire explained the sale, the old attorney became silent. Then she said, "I wondered how long it would take someone to call." 2 hours later, Elena arrived carrying a sealed legal file. She was 78 and walked with a silver cane. She placed the file on the archive table. Margaret did not trust any succession arrangement that depended on one person behaving well forever, she said. She understood companies better than most lawyers. Inside the file was an amendment executed 8 months before Margaret's death. It changed the voting authority of her 20% trust interest. If any family shareholder attempted to sell substantially all company assets without unanimous consent from the living family shareholders, the trust's voting authority transferred temporarily to a 5-member employee stewardship council. Richard could not control the trust vote. Neither could I. The employees would decide. Did Richard know? Claire asked. Elena looked toward the opened envelope. He attended the meeting in which Margaret discussed the amendment. He objected strongly. Did he receive a copy? Yes. Richard had not merely overlooked the amendment. He had removed it from the archive and proceeded as though it did not exist. That discovery could stop his sale. But stopping the sale would not create the money needed for payroll. For the first time since the wedding, I understood that defeating Richard was not the same as saving anything. I spent the next 5 days doing what I should have done years earlier. I listened. I met with project managers, carpenters, masons, estimators, accountants, and apprentices. I asked what could be sold without destroying the company. I asked which projects were profitable and which existed because my name had made people afraid to cancel them. The answers were uncomfortable. 2 showcase projects I had personally championed were losing millions. An old hotel I insisted on purchasing had never produced the tourism revenue I predicted. A warehouse full of architectural salvage was valuable to me and expensive to everyone else. Richard had not caused every financial problem. Some carried my signature in more ways than one. Louise and 4 other employees formed the stewardship council required by Margaret's amendment. They agreed to consider Vanguard's offer. They also gave us 7 days to present an alternative. Claire contacted a regional preservation foundation. Nadine negotiated with a community bank. Patricia identified 3 non-essential properties that could be sold. Jonah, who worked in commercial planning, created a restructuring model. Sophie did something more difficult. She asked her father to meet her. They met in the empty wedding venue. The flowers had been removed, but the stage and tables remained. I was not present. Sophie later told me what happened. Richard arrived carrying the same calm expression he wore in every crisis. He sat where she had signed the statement 3 months earlier. Sophie placed the forged trust authorization in front of him. "Did you copy my signature?" Richard looked at it. "Yes." She had expected denial. His admission frightened her more. "Why?" "Because the bank needed the collateral. And you would have refused. It was my money. It was company stock placed in your name before you were old enough to understand what it was. It still belonged to me. I planned to replace every dollar after the sale. What if the sale failed? It was not going to fail." Sophie stared at him. "You keep answering moral questions with schedules." Richard looked away. "You grew up in a home paid for by that company. Your education, your travel, your wedding, your entire life came from it. When the company needed something from you, I made the decision you were too inexperienced to make. You did not ask me. I could not risk the wrong answer." Sophie began crying. "Do you understand that is what Grandpa is accusing you of? You decided no one else could be trusted to answer." Richard's voice softened. "I have spent 14 years preventing this family from losing everything. Your grandfather disappeared into grief. Your aunt left. Your grandmother became sick. Every time something broke, everyone looked at me. And now you want sympathy because you became the person who broke us?" Richard stood. "I became the person willing to do what survival required." Sophie answered. "No. You became the person who needed survival to require whatever you had already decided." She left him sitting alone in the room where he had attempted to turn her wedding into proof of his victory. Our restructuring plan was not elegant. It required selling the unused hotel, 2 development parcels, and part of the architectural archive. It required canceling the projects I loved most. Executive salaries would be reduced. My dividend would be suspended. The Preservation Foundation agreed to purchase the historic workshop and lease it back to the company permanently. That protected the building from redevelopment. The community bank offered new financing if 51% of company ownership transferred over 5 years into an employee trust. The employees would gain board representation immediately. I would lose control. So would Richard. For the plan to work, I had to contribute half of my shares to the employee trust and place the remainder under independent voting supervision for 3 years. Claire agreed to contribute 5% of hers. Sophie offered the restored portion of her trust as a secured investment, but the council refused. Louise told her, "Your family has used your future as company collateral enough." The stewardship vote was scheduled for the following Friday in the Bellwether workshop. Vanguard's representatives presented first. They promised immediate debt repayment, stable employment for at least 18 months, modern equipment, and access to national contracts. They did not promise that the Bellwether workshop would remain open after those 18 months. They did not promise to preserve the training program. They did not promise that jobs would remain local. Richard spoke after them. He wore no jacket and used no presentation screen. He looked tired. "I know many of you believe I used your jobs to pressure my family," he said. "That is partly true. I did it because your jobs were actually at risk." He described the financial crisis honestly. He accepted responsibility for hiding debt. He admitted using assets without proper authority. He did not mention Sophie's forged signature until Louise asked directly. Richard answered, "Yes. I signed her name. I believe the money would be restored before she was harmed." A worker near the back called out, "Is that what you would accept from one of us?" Richard did not answer immediately. "No." Then he looked at me. "My father's plan asks you to trust people who helped create this crisis. It requires asset sales that may take months. The bank can still withdraw. Vanguard's offer is certain." He was right. Our alternative involved risk. The room knew it. When my turn came, I stood in the place where Margaret once presented designs to cruise. For 47 years, people had listened because my name was on the building. That day, I had to earn their attention without it. "I came here prepared to tell you why Richard is wrong," I began. "But most of you already understand what he did. What you deserve to hear is what I did." I told them about the projects I refused to cancel. The meetings I missed. The reports I signed without reading. The oversight structure Margaret wanted and I rejected. I told them how I rewarded Richard for solving emergencies until he learned that emergencies placed him above rules. I told them how I confused ownership with wisdom. Then I said, "If our plan succeeds, the company will not remain mine. It should not. No family should be able to endanger 146 households because we cannot tell the difference between our relationships and your livelihoods." Richard stared at me. I continued. "Vanguard offers certainty for 18 months. Our plan offers risk with a voice. Under our proposal, employees gain board seats now and majority ownership over 5 years. You may vote us out. You may change the name. You may sell assets we considered sacred. What I will not do is ask you to save my legacy. Buildings exist longer when people stop treating them as monuments to themselves." The room remained silent. Then Louise asked Richard, "If Vanguard buys us, will you stay?" Richard answered, "For 3 years. That is part of my contract. And after? I don't know." Louise turned toward me. "If we choose your plan, will you stay?" "Only if the new board asks me. And if it doesn't? I will go home." The 5 members of the Stewardship Council left to vote. They returned 43 minutes later. Louise read the decision. 4 members voted against the Vanguard sale. 1 voted in favor. The workshop erupted. Some people applauded. Some looked terrified. Several cried. Richard did none of those things. He folded his copy of the offer, placed it on a chair, and walked toward the exit. Sophie stood near the door. For a moment, father and daughter faced each other. Richard appeared ready to speak. Then he walked past her. The vote stopped the sale. It did not stop the consequences. Vanguard filed a claim for negotiation expenses. The original bank demanded additional guarantees. The company's insurers opened an investigation. Sophie reported the forged authorization. Richard resigned as chief operating officer. The independent custodian referred the falsified documents and concealed debt reports to prosecutors. He was not taken away in handcuffs. Real consequences often arrive through scheduled meetings, certified letters, and rooms where no one raises their voice. Richard eventually pleaded guilty to falsifying a financial instrument and making material misrepresentations to lenders. He received probation, community service, and an order prohibiting him from serving as an officer of a company for 5 years. He sold his remaining investment property to restore Sophie's trust and settle part of the company's losses. Elaine separated from him. She said she could not forgive the forgery. Richard said she had known about the sale. She answered that knowing about a sale was not the same as knowing what he had done to complete it. Their marriage did not survive the year. Some employees believed Richard's punishment was too harsh after everything he had sacrificed. Others believed it was too gentle because powerful people often call fraud a difficult business decision. Both groups contained people he had helped. Both contained people he had frightened. The restructuring nearly failed twice. The hotel sold for less than expected. A major client canceled after reading about our court dispute. For 3 weeks, we believed the community bank would withdraw. Then the Preservation Foundation increased its investment. 2 former clients returned. Employees agreed to temporary reductions in hours rather than layoffs. Senior managers, including me, received no compensation for 6 months. 1 year later, Caldwell Restoration Group still existed. It was smaller. It employed 119 people instead of 146. Every lost position mattered. But the workshop remained open. The apprenticeship program survived. Employees controlled 2 of 7 board seats immediately, with more transferring each year. The new board asked Claire to serve as independent legal counsel. It asked me to remain as a project advisor for 12 months. I accepted with one condition. My office store would no longer carry the word founder. Louise replaced it with a smaller sign. It said, "Henry Caldwell. Ask before entering. He is learning." Margaret would have appreciated it. Sophie and Jonah postponed their honeymoon, but they did not postpone their marriage. They moved into a small rented apartment instead of the one Richard had promised to guarantee. Sophie returned every dollar recovered to an independently managed trust. She stopped speaking to her father for 6 months. Richard sent letters. She returned the first 3 unopened. She kept the 4th. It contained no explanation of the company, no mention of sacrifice, and no request for forgiveness. It said, "I taught myself that providing for you gave me the right to choose for you. I understand now that those are opposite acts. I will answer any question you ask, but I will not use the answer to request another chance." Sophie did not reply for 3 weeks. Then she sent one question. "Did you ever plan to tell me you used my signature?" Richard answered, "No. I plan to replace the money and make the truth unnecessary." Sophie later told me that was the first answer from him she trusted. Not because it was comforting. Because he did not improve it. My own relationship with Richard remained silent longer. I wrote several letters and discarded them. Every version began by describing my regrets and ended by asking him to understand me. That was not an apology. It was another negotiation. Eventually, I wrote only this. "I taught you that your value came from repairing what the rest of us damaged. Then I punished you when you believed that made every repair yours to control. I am sorry for comparing you to Michael. I am sorry for seeing your work without seeing its cost. What you did to Sophie and the company was wrong. What I did to you was wrong too. Neither a truth cancels the other." I mailed it without asking him to respond. He did not. 9 months passed. Then, on a rainy Tuesday morning, I arrived at the workshop and found Richard standing beside the original truck Margaret and I had purchased in 1979. The employee trust had approved restoration of the truck for the company's 50th anniversary exhibit. Richard was looking at the rust beneath the driver's door. He had lost weight. His hair had become grayer. He was wearing the old work jacket he had used before he became an executive. "What are you doing here?" I asked. "Luis asked me to estimate the metalwork." "Are you allowed to work for the company?" "As an outside tradesman. No financial authority. No management. No keys." He held up a visitor badge. The sight of it hurt more than I expected. Richard ran his hand above the damaged door without touching it. "Mom used to say this truck sounded like a drawer full of silverware falling downstairs." She was being generous. For a moment, we both smiled. Then he looked at me. "I received your letter." "I know." "How?" "It was not returned." Richard nodded. "I still believe the Vanguard sale would have protected more jobs in the short term." "That may be true. I still believe you left me alone with responsibilities no one person should have carried." "That is true." "And I still do not know how to forgive what you said about Michael." "I am not asking you to." He looked surprised. I continued. "I would like the chance to become someone you might forgive. But I do not get to set the schedule." Richard looked back at the truck. "The frame is good. Your mother would say that is what matters. She would also say damage should not be ignored because the frame survived. She would." He picked up his toolbox. "Luis said I can use Bay 4. Do you need help moving the truck?" Richard considered the question. Then he said, "Yes." We worked for 3 hours. We discussed measurements, tools, and the safest way to support the frame. We did not discuss the wedding, the trial, or Michael. Some conversations should not be avoided forever. But not every silence is avoidance. Sometimes silence is the first space two people share without one of them controlling what happens next. Richard returned the following Tuesday. Then the Tuesday after that. He invoiced the company like every other contractor. The board reviewed his work. Luis approved his payments. It was the first time in decades that Richard contributed without controlling the structure around his contribution. I think it frightened him. I know it changed him. 2 years after the wedding, Sophie invited the family to dinner in her apartment. She invited Richard. It was the first family meal they had shared since the reception. Before he arrived, she gave us 3 rules. No one would discuss the company unless she introduced the subject. No one would describe what Margaret would have wanted. And no one would explain another person's motives. Richard arrived carrying a pie from a bakery. Sophie looked at the box. "You didn't make that." "No. I have caused enough damage by believing confidence can replace qualifications." Jonah laughed first. Then Claire. Finally, Sophie smiled. Dinner was uncomfortable. We interrupted one another. Richard became defensive when Claire mentioned the employee trust. I began a story about Michael and stopped when I realized I had once again placed him at the center of a room he was no longer in. Nothing about the evening was graceful. That was what made it honest. After dessert, Sophie brought out the cream-colored folder from her wedding. The blue ribbon was still tied around it. Richard's face tightened. "Why do you still have that?" "I thought I needed it to remember what happened." "And now?" "I remember without carrying it." She removed her signed statement, Jonah's transcript of the recording, and the forged trust authorization. The originals were preserved with the court records. These were copies. Sophie fed them into a small paper shredder. Richard watched every page disappear. When the machine stopped, he asked, "Does this mean you forgive me?" Sophie shook her head. "No. It means I do not need evidence on my kitchen shelf to prove my memory belongs to me." Richard accepted the answer. 2 years earlier, he would have argued with it. Caldwell Restoration Group no longer carries that exact name. The employees voted to rename it Caldwell Heritage Cooperative. Some people expected me to object. I voted in favor. My name remains on the workshop because removing stone letters from a protected building requires more paperwork than anyone wishes to complete. That feels appropriate. The company is not the empire Margaret and I once imagined. It does not need to be. It is profitable again. Apprentices learn beside people who now own part of the work they perform. Major decisions require disagreement in a room rather than loyalty in a hallway. I retired at 74. This time, no one announced it before asking me. Luis organized a small gathering inside the workshop. There was no giant screen. No acquisition contract. No photograph carrying dates beneath it. The employees gave me a restored section of wood from the first boarding house Margaret and I saved. Across it, they carved the sentence she had spoken when everyone else recommended demolition. "The wood is still good." Richard stood near the back. He did not speak during the ceremony. After everyone left, he approached me. "Do you remember the night of Sophie's wedding?" he asked. "Yes." "Do you ever wish she had stayed quiet until the next day?" I considered the question. "No. I wish you had told me the truth before she needed to speak. I wish I had listened years before you believed deception was the only language that produced action." Richard nodded. "I thought the announcement would make the decision permanent. Because people had applauded? Because you hate disappointing a room." He knew me well. That was why his plan had almost succeeded. "I spent most of my life believing leadership meant being the person who could not be stopped by doubt," he said. "What do you believe now?" Richard looked toward the employee names painted beside the workshop bays. "I think leadership may be the ability to survive an answer you did not choose." It was the closest thing to peace we had reached. Not forgiveness completed. Not trust restored. Only two men standing inside a building neither of them controlled anymore. My son announced my retirement at his daughter's wedding because he believed a public celebration could transform coercion into consent. He believed applause could become proof. He believed saving the company entitled him to decide who was capable, whose signature could be borrowed, and which truth could wait until after the money arrived. For a long time, I blamed him for becoming that person. Then I recognized the lessons I had taught. I taught Richard that the child who remains receives every burden. I taught him that producing the correct result matters more than explaining the method. I taught him that authority belongs to whoever is willing to act while everyone else is grieving. He took those lessons farther than I ever imagined. But he did not invent them alone. That understanding did not excuse the forged signature. It did not return Sophie's trust or repair his marriage. It did not mean the company should have remained in his hands. Understanding is not acquittal. It is simply the point where punishment stops pretending to be the same thing as truth. The cream-colored folder is gone now. The sale agreement remains in the company archive beside Margaret's trust amendment, the restructuring plan, and the first employee ownership certificate. No single document tells the complete story. One proves Richard lied. One proves I signed without reading. One proves Margaret anticipated the danger. And one proves the people most affected were finally allowed to decide. Sophie once asked whether I regretted losing control of the company. I told her the truth. Some mornings, I miss walking into the workshop and knowing every person would stop when I spoke. Then I remember what silence allowed our family to become. A company can survive a leader being questioned. A family can survive disappointment. A legacy can survive changing hands. What neither can survive forever is one person deciding that everyone else's voice is an obstacle. The night Richard announced my retirement, he told the room he was placing the future in safer hands. In the end, that part became true. Just not in the way he planned. The future did not remain in my hands. It did not remain in his. It was divided among the people who had spent years carrying it while our family argued about who deserved to own it. And for the first time since Margaret died, I could look at what we built without asking whether it still belonged to me. It was standing. The wood was still good. That was enough.